Right, so I found myself at 21 years old, and I realized I hadn't really taken much consideration or thought on happiness itself. I had kind of thought that it was something that if I worked hard in school and in my social life and work, that I would just happen upon it. And then, we started looking at all these different areas of happiness and from different time periods and different cultures, and I started to realize that it was something that takes thought. And so what I decided to do was I was going to make a sculpture for my series, and while I was doing it, I was going to record my emotions. And so while I'm working, I'm constantly trying to identify the emotions that I'm feeling, but I'm also trying to correlate those emotions with the reason that I'm feeling them at that moment. And so a little bit about the series is, this is for my series one of many. What I'm trying to do in this is I take a lot of inspiration from the minimalist artists like Donald Judd and Sol LeWitt. And I was really fascinated with the minimalist idea of reduction, and what I wanted to do was couple that with a powerful flow of organic movement. So I wanted to take these solid geometric forms and have them move along a spline to create an organic movement. And so what I try to do with the series is they're unit forms. So unlike a lot of Sol LeWitt and Donald Judd, which is a unit structure, so each shape is the same in a unit form, but a unit structure, they would all be placed the same. And so what I try to do is I try to make a flow of movement, sometimes in opposing, sometimes just try to make it look like it really shouldn't balance like it does. And so I went into the studio, and I am a really anxious person all the time, just really anxious all the time, really high strung. I talk fast, I shake a lot, move my legs. And so I'm walking in the studio and I'm trying to think of my thoughts these whole times, and that's weird to me too. And so, I'm walking in and it's a month before school ends, and I'm thinking to myself, where did all this time go? I have way too much stuff to do. Do I even have time to be here right now? And I forgot to pay my internet bill. I was stressed about that, which was silly because I could just go home and pay it. But the point is, my mind was racing with a lot of thoughts. And I went over to my locker and I started putting on the safety gear that I always do when I get ready to make a sculpture. And I put on the respirator, and it makes a very Darth Vader-esque noise when I breathe, and I've always found it very amusing. And I giggled to myself, and that was the first point when I was writing my journal that I realized that I had stopped thinking about the things that stressed me out. And maybe that's because it's funny, or maybe it's because it's sort of the ritual that I do every time I begin to work on something. And what I began to find was that the sort of ritual aspect of this is very important to me. When I'm making these unit forms, it's important to me to have as much mechanical precision as a handmade object can have. So I want them to be as close to the same as they possibly can be. And so I go in and I start with 15-foot long 2x4s, really cheap 2x4s from Home Depot, and I put them through the planer. And all of these processes, like planing the wood, I'm trying to do it the exact same. And so my journal of thoughts becomes much more concentrated. It becomes, I don't know, it's like there was a lot of clutter in my thoughts before, and that has been concentrated down to, how am I going to make this the same? How am I going to make sure? It's a lot of just working with the process, and and so after the planer, it's loud and stuff like that. I don't know, but another interesting thing, and why I mentioned that it was loud, is I've always thought of the studio as a very quiet place. While writing the paper for it, I was looking at a study on time perception, because I was interested in that as well, because while I'm in the studio, I lose track of time a lot. And I think the study was called When Time Flies You're Having Fun, the saying and stuff. And it was talking about how um, not only does enjoying something make the time move differently, but actually if you think that the time is moving quickly, then it's going to be more enjoyable to you. And so I think a lot of it has to do with me going in and doing these same things and not keeping track of the time. But it was talking about when you're enjoying yourself and time feels like it's moving faster, these sort of loud noises don't affect you near as much. And the studio is very loud, and I always think of it as a quiet place, but I think it's because it's one of the only times where I feel like my thoughts aren't racing. And so then, I start cutting the boards for this sculpture, and they're cut the same way 33 times. There's 33 cuts in there, and so you just measure and sand and cut, and I'm still not really thinking about any of those anxieties that I arrived at the studio thinking about. So then, after they're cut, and I can take off the ear muffs and the respirator, and I'm just putting them together, which I just glue and screw them together. All of a sudden, I found myself thinking about those anxieties again, but in a much different way. I was able to, while doing something with my hands and while working, able to think about them sort of individually, each one at a time, which is something I really struggle with. And I think it's has to do with that I'm making something, and I'm having to think about something, even if that thought, I've made these shapes so many times that the making of it, I don't think about it very actively. It's more of a second nature thing. And so I think that opens an opportunity for me to be able to focus on other aspects of my life, other stresses. I remember sitting there and I was writing down what I was thinking, and at that point the biggest anxiety I was feeling was the fact that I was recording my thoughts, which made me feel strange. But I was able to look at each one individually and really sort of come up with solutions for them. Just like the internet bill stressing me out, I was like, well, I can just go home and pay that. The sort of anxieties left while I'm able to do two things at once. But this part of the process, I guess, doesn't really have anything to do with other people because I'm just making the shapes themselves. It's not until I start assembling the sculpture that I start to feel a different sort of stress. But that's a positive stress, and I think that sort of stress invokes creativity because I start to think about aesthetics and how the viewer is going to see my sculptures. Sculpture and art is interesting to me because if I wrote a description of this or asked anyone to write a description of it, everyone's description would be slightly different based on their perspective in life. And so without the actual sculpture there itself, the sort of reference isn't there, and you can't get a clear picture. And so what I like about it is I have to think about what other people are going to think about it, in the sense that I enjoy hearing the perspectives of other people on it, and it gives me new perspectives of it. The creation of it, although it does give me anxiety, I think is very rewarding because I think making something that you made that doesn't really exist before then takes vulnerability. And over this time where I've been thinking about happiness, I have come to the conclusion that vulnerability is very important. If you're not vulnerable, you're only doing things for yourself, and I don't think that's very rewarding. And so I guess what I found is that I always knew that I liked making sculptures and liked making things, but I didn't really realize beforehand what it was that actually made me feel happiness from it. And I think it was just the fact that it really slows me down. It's like a form of meditation. And then the excitement afterwards of making something that I enjoy, which sometimes takes quite some time. I took this one apart 4 times before it was done, but that's the good thing about them all being the same, is you can just take them apart and move them. But that sort of excitement, I think, compels me to work on those other aspects of my life. Is after I've been able to think about them clearly, and then I feel good about something, I feel proud about something that I've made, it compels me to move forward and to find happiness.